The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Bored with your boring cardio? Stop pedaling that snooze cycle to Nowheresville and try some cardio that's actually fun. Supernatural Fitness, available on MetaQuest. Isn't that right, Jane Fonda?
Cardio will never be boring again.
Sweat to the beat of thousands of chart-topping songs inside stunning virtual landscapes.
Bet your stationary bike can't do that.
Visit GetSupernatural.com and join the next fitness revolution. Supernatural VR Fitness, only on MetaQuest. Rated Teen for Teen.
Amateur Traveler, episode 867. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about trains and tanks, cathedrals and castles, a homestay, an esker, and a wife-carrying competition as we go to Finland by train. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Finland. I'd like to welcome back to the show Jane Deer, who is a travel writer. Most recent book that Jane has written is Tales of an Interrailer, and we'll talk more about what that means and what that book's about. But Jane, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be back.
And I say welcome back. Jane did a wonderful episode with us about Bolivia not all that long ago. And Jane, where are we talking about this time?
We're talking about Finland, which my husband and I spent several weeks travelling around by train in the spring. It's a beautiful time to visit Finland. And it was part of a 3-month Interrail trip. For North Americans, the equivalent is the Eurail. And it's a very popular rail pass that you can get in various forms. We had 3 months continuous first class. We don't normally travel first class, I would add. And 2 weeks of that was traveling in Finland, which was good value for money because Finland is not a cheap country. And we were lucky enough to get our rail passes on a half price deal. We did very well from them, but the 2 weeks we spent in Finland were absolutely wonderful, and we would highly recommend it. I have visited once before, in my early days of interrailing, when I was about 24, 25, and hadn't returned. So it was really good to spend a couple of weeks travelling around the country. And it's an easy country to travel in, I have to say.
And why should someone go to Finland?
Many reasons. One of the most notable is that it's the happiest country in the world. For the last 6 years, it's been declared the happiest country in the world on the World Happiness Report. So they've been conducting these reports for the last 11 years, and Finland's been the happiest country for 6 years. I have to say I was a little sceptical to start with because they do have half the year where it's very dark, and there can be a problem with alcohol. Suicide rates can be quite high, but actually having spent 2 weeks in Finland, and we did a homestay at one point, I totally got it. I did understand. I can explain a bit more why, perhaps when I talk about the homestay. But I could understand why it's one of, or the happiest country in the world.
It also has the highest rates of coffee consumption in the world,
Oh, I
although
didn't know that, but
a not as strong a coffee as some places. So for coffee drinkers, this may suddenly have made sense to you. For me, not so much. But
yes, I'm a coffee drinker, so absolutely. I have to say, I didn't notice that element of it particularly. But yeah, it's a fabulous country, not just because it's the happiest in the world. One of the reasons for that is the people are very generous and they're very socially minded, so they support each other. It's obviously a rich country, so that helps make it one of the happiest, if not the happiest country in the world. Low corruption. But I think what convinced me was mutual trust. So, very low crime rate, very safe country to travel in, and they have a really good work life balance. So, unlike in North America, they take a few more weeks' holiday, and they will often, when they've got children, they will scale down on the amount of time they work. And they have very good maternity leave and sick and their healthcare education. As a teacher in England, we will always have the Finnish education system held up as being the best in the world. And they have very high levels of literacy, etc. So obviously that is more important for living there. But as a traveller, kind of thing is important. You can feel very relaxed, sit back and enjoy the amazing scenery in Finland. It's a beautiful country. You probably will have seen more trees than you will have seen in your lifetime by the time you've travelled around Finland, because it's got a lot of pine and birch forest. 2/3 of it is forested. It's the most densely forested country in Europe, which, coming from England, that's probably one of the least densely forested countries in Europe.
Iceland and Greenland would have to beat you there if we count them as part
Yeah.
of Europe.
Yeah, but you do see a lot of trees, but there's also a lot of beautiful lakes, and the lakes have small rocky islands with pine trees. And when the sun's shining, we were very lucky, it was beautiful and sunny. Pine trees reflect in the water to make a spherical image, and it's very pretty. They have some sort of ancient castles on their lakes. But if you look at a Google map of Finland, you will see that it's got a lot of lakes, an awful lot of lakes. And it's a large country, actually. I was surprised when I Googled it. I thought it would be smaller than Great Britain, but actually it's significantly bigger, mainly because a lot of Finland is wilderness. It's the eighth biggest country in the world. It's comparable to Germany, which surprised me. And in North American terms, it's similar size to Montana and to New Mexico, just to put it in context. Yeah, so it's big because, of course, it goes way above the Arctic Circle, the border with Sweden and with Norway, but also, more importantly, with regards to its history with Russia. So hence it's recently joined NATO, has a huge border with Russia. And it's probably the first Western or the most easterly Western country in the north, which is interesting.
Excellent. Shall we start talking about your itinerary here of what you
Yes.
saw and what you recommend we see in Finland?
Yeah. If you're coming from North America, I guess your place of entry would be Helsinki. However, if you're doing it as part of a trip to Europe, you can fly from London to some of the smaller airports, Tampere or Turku, for example, on the budget airlines. So it opens
Okay.
up more options if you are not just coming over for a week or 2 weeks in Finland, but you're doing it as part of a visit to Europe. So you might want to fly to London, spend a bit of time in London, the UK, and then fly on using one of the budget airlines, which are relatively cheap. And then you can go to Helsinki, Tampere, or to Turku. And although it's a huge country, actually, it only has a population of 5.5 million, and that is all centered in the southern area. You can fly into Helsinki, you can go to Tampere, which is a city 2 hours by train or car north of Turku, which is 2 hours west of Helsinki. If you have a week's itinerary, those are the three places I would recommend. with some side trips, some day trips that you can do from Helsinki. So I know that you've got an episode on Helsinki.
We do.
Yeah, I'll just
It's
give
been a
you.
while.
Yes, it's been a while. Okay. I'll give you my sort of perspective on it. Obviously, we were traveling around by train for 3 months. We saw a lot of stations, and my favorite station was Helsinki Central Station. Out of all of the Art Nouveau stations we saw in France, Helsinki was my favorite. It's got a 48-meter high clock tower that was the first of several towers that were then scaled up to be the design for the 1922 Chicago Tribune Tower, which I believe was the first skyscraper in America. So when you look at it and then you look at the Tribune Tower, I had to look at the images on the internet, but I guess anyone that lives near there or has visited recently would go, oh, yes, looks like the Tribune Tower. So it was sort of a model for it, and then it was scaled up to be the Chicago Tribune Tower. It's made out of granite. So Art Nouveau in the Nordic countries is a particular type of Art Nouveau. It's much more angular and normally granite compared to the very elegant, ornate French Art Nouveau. So you'll notice that when you go to the Nordic countries. It's beautiful, but in a different way. It's more solid and chunky, I would say.
Okay.
Now, this Art Nouveau station has 4 huge, sort of almost Soviet figures outside, and they hold globes. They're very striking on the outside of the building. They hold globes to illuminate the building. However, because we were there in June, it never really got dark. It may have got a bit twilight
Okay,
about
sure.
2:30 in the morning, but that's the thing to remember is obviously depending on the time of year that you go. We were there and it was pretty much 24-hour daylight. But if you go in the winter, you get the converse to that, the opposite.
Right.
It's 24 hours darkness, certainly in the north, the very far north. But I would recommend a winter visit because the Nordic countries, including Finland, in the winter are totally different to the experience of going in midsummer. And I've been to Nordic countries, not Finland actually, but to Nordic countries in the winter. And it's a fabulous experience of so much snow and frozen lakes and rivers, and obviously the Northern Lights. So Finland
Right.
is very popular for the Northern Lights up in the Arctic Circle, but in the winter. But anyway, so we didn't see it illuminated, but you would in the winter. And it reminded me a bit of the Musée d'Orsay that's in Paris that's been turned into a museum. I thought, oh, I'll come back and they will have turned it into an art gallery because it's so beautiful with big sort of arching ceilings and that. But yeah, you start there if you're coming into Helsinki by train, but I would recommend seeing it even if you come by air and you don't ever get on a train. Go and just have a look at the central station.
Okay.
I always like to go to the National Museum of a country. There are various art museums. So we went to the National Museum of Finland. Finland is a very young country. It didn't actually become a country until 1917 after the Russian Revolution. So from the 1200s, it was under Swedish rule. It was a kingdom that was part of Sweden. And then it became a Russian kingdom or was taken over by the Russians and became part of the Russian Empire in 1809. So obviously the Russians defeated the Swedes, did a bit of a land grab and took Finland. However, at the time of the Russian Revolution, 1917, Finland declared independence. So it's a relatively young country, but it always had its own identity. And in the Museum of Finland, a few things I would highlight would be the Viking relics that have been found in the Finnish area in Finland.
Okay.
So beautiful jewellery and costume and weapons from the Viking times. And there's a Russian Tsar's throne, which was used by the Tsar when he visited the Kingdom of Finland, which was part of the Russian Empire at the time. So they particularly struck me. Again, it's an Art Nouveau building. It has a stone bear outside that's quite distinctive. So we enjoyed that. We went to the market square, which is down by the harbour, Capitoli, and you can see the fish being brought in. There's lots of food stalls and you can buy fresh vegetables, etc. It's very colourful. And we had moose burgers down there.
Okay.
Which was an experience. You don't often get moose where we come from on the menu.
Nor do we, yeah.
No, they were delicious. So if you get the opportunity, I think it was moose burger and chips for €15. So that was not bad. The only thing you had to be careful of, and they warned you of this, was the seagulls. Nordic seagulls are in a class of their own when it comes to stealing things. But we were fine. We sat under an awning and, really enjoyed a moose burger. We did also, while we were in Finland, have reindeer soup, which was nice. I would recommend having the local dishes, something a bit unusual. Now, there are two cathedrals in Helsinki. There's the Lutheran, which was built by the czar. It's a huge white building. It's a bit like a wedding cake with a big dome. And when you go inside, it's typically Lutheran in that it's very plain. But from the outside, it's in a big square. It's very dramatic, up high on a platform. And that's worth a visit. And then a total contrast is the Uspenski Cathedral, again 1800s, 1868, and it's the largest Orthodox cathedral in Western Europe. So if you've never visited Eastern Europe, which I have many times, it is very typical. So you've got big gold dome cupolas on the outside, lots of spires, and then you've got inside the icons, the crosses, lots of gold leaf. So the contrast between the very plain Lutheran Cathedral, Helsinki Cathedral, and the Uspenski Orthodox is quite a contrast. They're very close to each other. The Uspenski is near the old warehouse area and it's on the water. And the thing you'll notice about when you're in Finland and the other Nordic countries is you're never far from water. So
Right.
what we used to do is go and have a drink on the deck of a boat. So they have lots of bar boats. And on this occasion, we had one on an old lighthouse boat, sat up on the deck, looking out over the harbour. And they said it had actually been sunk during the war and then brought up to the surface and was now a bar. We did that in various places in Scandinavia. I can talk about that a bit later on. Now, day trips. We did a day trip to Suomenlinna Fortress, which I highly recommend. It's only 20 minutes from the market harbour, where we had the moose burgers. Suomenlinna, I hope I'm pronouncing that if you have any Finnish speakers, is Finnish castle, and it's on an island in the archipelago just off Helsinki. And it was originally called Svenborg Castle, which means Swedish castle. And it was built to deny the Russians access to the Baltic, which didn't succeed because during the Swedish-Russian War of 1808 to 1809, it was claimed by the Russians. And they strengthened and expanded it. And it's still a naval base, so they still train recruits there. But it's interesting to go and see the fortress, historic fortress. It's a large area. You can have a wander around. There were lots of barnacle geese with chicks when we were there. A bit defensive of their chicks, but they were very cute, fluffy chicks.
And we should say that it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well.
Correct. Yes, you're right. It is, which makes it even more important. And it's got a number of military museums on it. So we went to the military museum. My husband's really interested in his military history, but even he hadn't heard of all the wars that they've been involved in. So it started with the Civil War, early 20th century. Then there was the Winter War. I think it was against the Russians.
The war against Russia,
Yeah. The Continuation War. And they were all sub-wars of the sub-battles of the Second World War. Continuation War and the Lapland War, the Germans were definitely involved in. They were definitely against the Germans and the Russians in those wars. So quite a few, if you're interested in military history, and they had a lot of artifacts, tanks and uniforms and models to explain it. And they've also got a submarine that you can go around, the Vesico submarine. It was launched in 1933. It's quite a small submarine, and you can go on it. It sank a Russian merchant ship, the Vyborg, in its time, and took part in the continuation war, I think. And that's there for you to go on and get a feel for what it was like being on a submarine. I definitely came away thinking, I'm glad I'm not crew on a submarine.
Which is claustrophobic is the answer to
very.
of what it feels like to be in a submarine. Yes,
Absolutely, especially as this is a very small submarine. I've been on
right.
submarines before that are bigger, but this was a sort of a pocket-sized submarine. But it gives you a feel for what it's like to be on a submarine. And then I particularly liked the lighthouse church. I've never come across that combination before. So up on the hill, they had a church and the tower had a lighthouse on top. It brought a whole new meaning to the light of God.
Okay.
That was interesting. Yeah. As I say, it's only 20 minutes from the harbour, so it's well worth a visit. And it's nice going out into the archipelago. You go through a number of the islands and get to look back at Helsinki from the water. And it's not expensive to do that. We just bought tickets. It's like just going on a local bus. It's best to do it on the local service, not do it as a tour.
Okay.
Ah, bon chien. Bonjour, je suis Theo, a tour leader with Explore, and this is Punti. He's helping us find truffles under the trees next to this beautiful vineyard. Maybe for tomorrow's cooking class? We call it semi-heure. Parfait. Semi-o'clock. Not everyone gets to enjoy a Bordeaux sunset this way, but you will if you explore. No, Punti. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel. Explore.
Bored with your boring cardio? Stop pedaling that snooze cycle to Nowheresville and try some cardio that's actually fun. Supernatural fitness, available on MetaQuest. Isn't that right, Jane Fonda?
Cardio will never be boring again.
Sweat to the beat of thousands of chart-topping songs inside stunning virtual landscapes.
Bet your stationary bike can't do that.
Visit GetSupernatural.com and join the next fitness revolution. Supernatural VR Fitness, only on MetaQuest. Rated T for Teen.
Now, a couple of day trips, Porvoo, Porvoo, is a town, it's about an hour by bus from Helsinki. And I like Porvoo because it's one of the old traditional wooden towns that you find throughout Scandinavia, with all the old traditional wooden buildings. And of course, wood is definitely not in short supply in Finland. Wherever you go, in the sidings and along the tracks, huge piles of wood. So obviously they build all their houses, as they do in the other Nordic countries, from wood. And so Porvoo is a historic town. It's only 1 hour by bus. You can't get a train there, but it's about an hour by bus from the centre of Helsinki. And I definitely recommend that, particularly if you haven't been to other Nordic countries, to see their typical wooden buildings.
I enjoyed Porvoo. I've been to Helsinki and Porvoo, the only two places I've been in.
Yeah. So you had a good introduction to Finland. And they've also got an open air museum. We didn't go to this one, but they're very popular in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
So the Surasi, not sure if that's how you pronounce it, open air museum. So if you are there for a week, it's a good idea to go to the open air museum. It's quite close to the centre of Helsinki. It's on an island, but connected by a bridge. And it's just very characteristic of the north. So they bring in buildings, churches, houses, schools, old sawmills, old farms. It just gives you a feel for what the countryside would have been like 100 years ago plus. And they're very good at doing that in the Nordic countries. So I'd recommend that. We went to one in Sweden, so we didn't go to the one in Finland because they can be fairly similar. I think once you've done one on one trip, you don't need to do more, but I definitely recommend you do it once there.
Okay.
Okay, so then I would suggest you go up to Tampere, which is known as the Manchester of Finland. That's Manchester,
Okay.
UK, but I think you have a Manchester in, is it Connecticut or Massachusetts, that's quite industrial. And it's known as,
When you say the Manchester, Finland, we're talking about the industrial heartland.
yes, yes.
Okay.
So it's similar to
I'm not sure that
Manchester.
all of our listeners outside of the UK will get the
Yes.
Manchester reference, but okay.
Yeah, so it's Manchester, UK, because of the Industrial Revolution. So in Manchester, there's a lot of old warehouses and tall chimneys that date back to the time of the Industrial Revolution and the textile industry. And in Finland, when the Industrial Revolution reached Finland a bit later, they drew on the expertise of North England. And a lot
Sure.
of people went to work from England in the textile factories, I guess to take their knowledge and skills with them. So I was on a bus. We just crossed the border actually in the north. And I got chatting to a man called Albert. And he said, oh, my 6 times great grandfather is English or was English. He said he travelled from England to work in the factories of Tampere in the 1880s because he'd worked in England and could get a job working in similar factories. And he actually was interesting because he was an army reservist. So he was clutching his beret with a golden lion badge, told me all about, because they have conscription and then they stay
Right.
in the reserves. That's very common in the Nordic countries, including Finland. And so we were chatting. But it was interesting because we were then going to Tampere. And when you go to Tampere, you think, oh, yes, gosh, this is like Northern England. So although they don't have those textile factories anymore, obviously they've moved on, but they've kept them. The Finlayson textile factory, which was opened in 1820 by a Scotsman, James Finlayson, has now been converted into museum, shops and restaurants. So it's quite nice that they've kept the industrial heritage. And along the river, you've got all the old brick chimneys rising up. So it does have a very different feel to to Helsinki and to Turku, the old capital, which is quite
Okay.
nice because it's not more of the same. So the geography of Tampere it's between 2 lakes. One lake is higher than the other, and there's a river that runs from one lake to the next. And because it runs downhill, they harnessed the power of the water running down that river into the
Oh,
lower
sure. Okay.
lake, into a
Makes
weir.
sense.
Yeah, and the weir is still there. So you can wander along the river. There we had a drink on the river on a barge boat, so a barge that had previously been a German river barge and was now a bar. So we sat on the river and watched the world go by, really, with a beer. And it's nice just to have a wander around. They've got an attractive old bridge from 1929, which has got big statues on it. And I think because of the Russian influence, it felt very Soviet. Now, they weren't under Soviet rule, but it did feel like one of the bridges that you would get in Moscow or around Russia and the Soviet Union. And they have, my favourite building was the Art Nouveau fire station because there's a bit of a story to it. So it was designed by a female architect, Wivi Lon, and she was clearly an excellent architect, but the male architects were rather jealous of her and they wanted her to marry because when she married, she would no longer be able to, in those days, practice as an architect. She never did marry. That it's rumoured that she was a lesbian. Obviously, they didn't get their wish. And she continued as an architect. And it's a beautiful building. And the fact it's a fire station, probably the most beautiful fire station I've ever seen. And that's right in the centre for people to see. There's a couple of notable churches. The Tampere Cathedral is Art Nouveau and very beautiful. Lots of beautiful Art Nouveau pillars and stained glass. When I was there, they had police choirs practicing, and apparently singing in choirs is very popular in Finland. So that wasn't unusual. And then, as a total contrast, is the Calavan Church, which was described as looking like a huge grain silo. When I went to see it, it does look exactly like a huge grain silo. But it's strangely
It does.
attractive. Yeah, doesn't it? Yeah. It's really high, really tall. And when you
Mhm.
go into it, you peer up at the ceilings. It's all pine wood that ripples from one side to the other, whether it
Hmm.
be the pews towards the organ or the ceiling. It's absolutely beautiful, very unusual, very
Very
striking.
Nordic modern, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Now, something else in Tampere that we did was go up to the largest esker in the world, which is just outside Tampere. And an esker is a huge gravel hill that was
Okay.
left at the end of the last ice age. It's the highest in the
Okay.
world. And it gives you great views out over both of the lakes either side. And we had a wander around there. There's a viewing tower that gives you the opportunity to look back towards Tampere and its brick chimneys. And it's got some old wooden buildings on top of the Esker. So I'd certainly recommend going up there. When we were in Tampere, we did a homestay actually, which was really interesting because we stayed with a family who live in a community, and they were mainly the reason why I concluded it is a very happy country, Finland. So they lived in an old wooden house that was one of 40 houses that encircle a courtyard, and everybody that lives in that, all the families are part of the community. And it was originally built for the workers of the shoe factory. And it's quite special because a lot of the old wooden houses in Tampere were knocked down in the 20th century and just
Okay.
replaced by tower blocks and modern buildings. So this area is very historic and unique. And the lovely family we stayed with, they were a family of four, but their house is actually two of the old houses knocked together. And the workers from the shoe factory, they would have had a large family in just half of what is now their apartment. And it still had all the old tiled fireplaces, the very Nordic Scandinavian tile fireplaces that go right up to the ceiling. And most interestingly, there were several bullet holes in one of them, and they said they were from the Civil War, way back in 1917, early 20th century. So that was a little bit of history, and they cooked us some typical Finnish food, which I'd recommend listeners try if they go there. So spinach pancakes were delicious, and summer soup, which is lots of vegetables. And they all have communal gardens. They took me to see some of the communal gardens with big summer houses. And that's an important part of Finnish culture, is to have a summer house, because a lot moved in from the countryside into the cities
Okay.
and they missed the countryside. So they established communal gardens, and because of the high levels of trust, you can grow things in your communal garden that may be a few kilometres from where you live and nobody steals it, unlike And like from where I come from, you have to be very careful. You grow things and then they can be stolen, but that clearly didn't happen there as
See,
part
I know
where
other places in the US where you lock your car in the summertime to keep people from leaving their zucchini in it and giving it to you. So it just depends where you live.
Yes, it does depend where you live. Yes. Yeah. Finland's very much like that. Yes. But they had, for example, a big woodworking area that anybody
Okay.
in the community could use with
Nice.
expensive tools. And I said, is this not locked up? Joanna, who was our host, said, oh, no, there's no need to lock it. It's like, there would be where I live near London. And they had a big room full of chest freezers for all the produce from the communal gardens because it's very abundant. But they can't fit the chest freezers into the small housings. Again,
Oh, okay.
it was very, very lots of trust. There was also a sauna. Now, saunas are very
Of
popular
course.
in Finland, yes. And the sauna was
My understanding is when you go to build the house, first you build the sauna.
absolutely, yes, definitely. And the sauna, I always thought it was Swedish, but it's not, it's Finnish. Obviously, Finland was part of Sweden when it was invented. And obviously, it's popular throughout the Nordic countries, but it is definitely Finnish. And even when we stayed in some more budget type hotels, they had a sauna that you could use. And it was quite nice. There was a session where women could go from the community to the sauna. So I went with Joanna to the sauna, and it was the women's 2 hours, and we all sat and chatted, and they all speak excellent English. I always joke that they speak better English than most of the English because they learn it very grammatically. And it was the most natural thing for them to sit and chat, not just to me, but to each other in English. So you have no problem with communication in Finland because they do speak very good English, like in all the Nordic countries. And yeah, so we sat there. There's some etiquette that you have to learn. So you go in with no clothes on.
Okay.
Joanna gave me a small towel, and I assumed that was to mop my brow, but actually it was to sit on. And you have to
Okay.
shower before you go in, obviously, and that sort of thing. But there was a 10-year-old girl in there, and I said, oh, from what age can children use the sauna? Thinking it would be actually about 10. And they were like, oh, any age. Women have babies in the sauna. So I was like,
Huh.
oh, yeah, because I seem to remember when I was expecting a baby, there was a sign on the sauna saying pregnant women couldn't use it. But they said, oh, no, women do give birth in the sauna and they will take babies to the sauna. And I guess in the very cold winters, that is something that's quite cozy for them.
Well, and I'm seeing this city has been officially declared the sauna capital of the world
Oh, wow.
because it has most public saunas of any place in the world.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. One of the women who had actually produced a graphic novel on the community, she was talking about her husband's grandmother, who, because the housing in Victorian, like 1900s, they didn't have a bathroom. You'd go to the sauna once a week, which would be your wash. That would be the
Okay.
way you would bathe, would be through using the sauna. So, yeah, it's clearly very popular, and it's definitely something I would recommend you do while you're in Finland. They had a rota of jobs. I said, oh, do you get any slackers? Anybody that doesn't do their bit? So, for example, someone has to fire up the communal sauna and clean it out and that. And Joanna was
Got
like,
it.
oh, no, of course not. Because she said, if you're going to buy into this community, then you have to be somebody that's on board. You just wouldn't want to live there if you weren't prepared to be part of the rota and all
Interesting.
chip in. Yeah, so it was interesting. So, moving on from Tampere, we went to the Parola Tank Museum. Now, it was about half an hour by train south in a small place called Parola. Now, it may not be everybody's cup of tea, and we went there mainly because my husband is a bit of a tank fanatic. And there aren't actually many tank museums in the world, but Finland has one of a handful. And so we couldn't miss it. But if you're interested in history and military history, I'm not a tank fanatic, but I enjoyed it. It has a lot of tanks and military tanks and
Armored
armoured
cars.
carriers. Yeah. But most interesting was it had an armoured train. That
Okay.
that looked as if it was something straight out of a movie. That was very interesting. It had a Tiger 1 tank that was doing a tour, and originally from the Bovington Tank Museum, which my husband visits several times a year in the UK.
Okay.
Yes, if you are interested in military history, tanks, then it's definitely somewhere that I would recommend you visit. Very easy to access. We literally got a train to Parola and walked for about half an hour to get to the Tank Museum. And he was happy, my husband.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Okay, going west from Helsinki is Turku, which is the old capital of Finland. I guess the Kingdom of Finland before it was a country.
I think it
And
was a duchy technically,
yes,
but
a duchy, yeah.
yep.
Yes, this was the old capital. So it has a very different feel to both Helsinki and to Tampere. So it's well worth visiting. We enjoyed the cathedral. That's a medieval cathedral. It has been burnt down or suffered from being burnt several times. But yeah, it's a huge, attractive, very Nordic style building. And I would recommend that you go to its museum because I don't often go to cathedral museums because they can be quite similar. But this does have a lot of the medieval treasures that were saved from some of the fires. So,
Okay.
sort of the old carving from the Middle Ages and goblets and some of the old, what the priests would have worn. So, it would have originally been
Vestments.
Catholic, but become a Lutheran church. Yes, yeah. So that's worth a visit. And then the river is the focus. So we walked along the river. It's quite a long walk. It took us about an hour. But along the river, they have a lot of historic boats, and you can buy a ticket to visit all the historic boats. We particularly liked the Sigyn, Sigyn, which is a three-masted merchant ship built in Gothenburg in 1887.
Okay.
And there were a number of small naval vessels, and they're all along the riverside. So you can see them pretty well without buying a ticket, but you can buy a ticket and go on them if you wish.
Okay.
It's up to you. But it's an experience just walking along the river and seeing them, seeing the big masted ships, of which there are a number rising up above you. And then at the end, the other end from the Turku Cathedral is the Turku Castle, which is, having spent some time on our interrail trip in France along the Loire Valley, where you have all the fairy tale type castles. This is very much a sort of angular, chunky, solid looking castle, very typical of the Nordic countries. And it's great. It has been restored quite significantly in places. It's great for children because they do a lot to recreate medieval times. And there were lots of areas where you could try on costumes and experience what it was like as a castle in medieval times, because it does go back to the 1200s. So we enjoyed that. It's very photogenic. So there was a wedding going on there and they were having the photos taken outside. I definitely recommend that. On the way back, we went across the river. Rather than walk all the way back to the main bridge, we crossed the river on a chain ferry that's free. It takes a couple of minutes to go across the river, and that's quite a nice experience. You don't get many chain ferries in the Western world.
And a chain ferry, meaning there's a chain across the river that you're pulling yourself across on this very small boat. Yeah, okay.
Yes, yeah. And you just hop on it and across you go. And then we had our most unusual boat bar experience. So we went on a barge to have a beer on the river, which was nice. We had lovely weather in the spring. And I was talking to the young man that poured our beers. We always try the local beers. Unfortunately, alcohol is expensive in Scandinavia, but yeah, it has to be done, the odd beer. And he was telling me that the barge, after it had been used as a river barge up near Helsinki, had become a brothel. And he said when it was bought by the people that turned it into a bar, they found all the booths downstairs that had been used when it was a brothel. So every one of these ships seems to have a story. So it's always worth asking them what was the story of the ship before it became a bar or a restaurant or whatever. But it's very common, because they've got so many waterways, for them to have these old ships and turn them into restaurants or bars. So I'd recommend that you spend a bit of time having a drink or a meal on one of them. That would be the itinerary I would recommend if you just had a week.
Okay.
If you were coming for a winter holiday, it would be
Mm-hmm.
well worth going up to Rovaniemi, which is up on the Arctic Circle. It's very popular with people from Europe to go up there to see Santa Claus, to do dog sledding and snowmobiling across frozen lakes.
Okay.
And if
This
you're
is where Santa
lucky,
Claus lives in Finland, you're saying?
absolutely,
I
yeah.
did not know that. Okay.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, very popular place, because obviously he lives there. And you can go to visit his workshops, meet his elves, etc. And that is very popular. And if you're lucky, you'll see the Northern Lights. So
Mm-hmm.
last year, the Northern Lights were very good. Next winter, they're going to be better, and they're going to peak the year after because of solar activity. So people I spoke to said, oh, they were fantastic this year. They're going to be even better in the next couple of years. So it might be the time to go. And certainly when we were in Tampere, staying with people there, they said, oh, yes, the lakes freeze over and you can just go walking on the lake or skating.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, take advice from local people, because as the climate warms, it's not quite the same as it used to be in the past. But I've been in Scandinavia in the winter, in February, and people literally drive cars on the lakes and the
Sure.
rivers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a different experience to going midsummer. But midsummer's great because they obviously love midsummer because of having so much daylight compared to so much darkness in the winter.
Right. Sure.
And they have lots of festivals. They have lots of country music festivals. They have welly throwing. My personal favourite was wife carrying festival. Not sure you'd get away with that in the UK, but
Okay.
yeah. And they do a lot of orienteering. We saw school children out orienteering in the summer. It's very popular in Finland, and I'm sure there's places.
You say the wife carrying festival, the wife carrying world championships,
No less.
no less.
Yes. I couldn't visualize it when Johanna, my homestay host, was telling me about it. But yes, I think I watched a short YouTube clip and was awestruck, really. That's
And my understanding is you can win your woman's weight in beer.
That's quite valuable, actually, in
Yeah,
Finland,
exactly.
because,
So,
yeah, beer is expensive. I know my husband was having beer, but unless you go to an official government alcohol shop, it's all low alcohol. So I quite like a glass of wine, and we got to Finland, and I was like, oh, the wine is similar cost to home. And then I realised it was 5% as opposed to 12.5%. It's not quite the same, yeah. But they do use the euro, which is useful if you're travelling in other parts of Europe, because most of Europe uses the euro,
right.
unlike the other Nordic countries that use versions of the krona. And Finland does stand out a little bit from the other Nordic countries. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, their languages are similar, but the Finnish language is very different. It's more
No,
related.
I noticed you were very careful to call it Nordic and not Scandinavian
Yes,
because the other three
that's
are
a
Scandinavian, but the four of them
yes,
are Nordic. Yeah, exactly.
yes. But in the UK, we often refer to Finland as Scandinavia. So, so it's how pedantic you're being. I think purists would say it's Nordic but not Scandinavian, but
Right.
a lot of people would just call it, along with Iceland, and even Denmark could be considered not to be Scandinavia. But yeah, so for the purposes of this, I'm calling it a Nordic country. Yes, yeah, but you will hear people call it Scandinavian. Yeah, but their language is more related to the Baltic states, even Hungarian,
Right.
not to the other Scandinavian countries, who can by and large understand each other and
Right.
speak to each other. But once you go over the border into Finland, that's not the case. But they all speak English, so you don't have to worry, really. Yeah, that's very good. And as I say, they use the euro. And it is an expensive country. We stayed in mid-range hotels,
Okay.
but they were on average €100, whereas in France we
That's
were
not
staying
terrible. Okay.
in equivalent that were sort of 60 to €70.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so it's more expensive. The other thing that you have to recognise about the whole of the Nordic area is they rely on technology, done away with people. So when you're a bit older like me, and I'm fairly au fait with technology, but not entirely, it can be a bit frustrating. So you'll have a lot of
Yep.
hotels and apartments where hotels, for example, they will text you a code to get into the room, or they will send you a key on
Sure.
an app, and there's no person. So that pushed my blood pressure up a little bit. But by and large, it was fine. It was fine. We got
We
it.
know that the birth rates are low in Europe, and Finland is lower than average. And so they
Yes.
are planning on getting by with fewer people. And of course, this is where Nokia was from. So they were big into cell phones well
Oh,
before
of
other
course.
places in the world. So
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. We never ended up sleeping on the park bench because we couldn't get into our hotel rooms. And
that's good.
everybody's really helpful. They gave me some Wi-Fi access to access my key and that sort of thing. The other thing you'll notice is at stations, bus stations, apart from the big cities, and there aren't many of those, they won't have people. So you'll have to buy your ticket online or from a
Okay.
machine. And then if you've got a problem, where do we get that rail replacement bus from? There's no one to ask.
Okay.
So it can be a little frustrating at times, but I don't think it's long before the rest of Europe goes that way. So it was good practice, I guess, for me.
So you
But
were living slightly in the future. Okay.
yeah, it did feel a bit like that. It was a bit futuristic at times, but I guess it's a way of cutting costs, because if you don't
Sure.
need to employ a person. But the trains are excellent in Finland. We obviously travel by train, but they have also good buses, or hiring a car is an option because the roads are excellent, having a very harsh climate. They don't have potholes and things like that. But the trains, very modern, double decker with big picture windows. When you travel by train, it can be a bit like, oh, it's another tree, another fir tree, and it's quite
Sure.
a flat country. It's not, it's so different to Norway, which is like
Right.
scenery on speed. And then Sweden's kind of in between. It's got lots of rolling hills and mountains full of fir trees, whereas Finland is pretty much flat south of the Arctic Circle. People do go up to the Arctic Circle to hike, where there's the highest mountain is 1,300 meters, which is the same as Ben Nevis in the UK, the highest mountain. But you have to go way up into the wilderness for that. You'll notice most of it is flat. Yeah.
As we start to wind this down, anything else people need to know before they go to Finland?
No, I think I've just about covered everything that I wanted to. Board games. They love board games. You'll probably find, if you do a homestay or if you're in a hotel, there'll be lots of board games. They all seem to be into their board games. So if you
And
like
I
board games,
assume we're talking about the newer Euro games rather than the older Monopoly style board games.
no, the older Monopoly, Scrabble,
Okay.
but lots
Okay.
of other versions. Yeah. Yes, not computer games, although I'm sure quite a few are into their computers.
Well, I say newer, there's a class of board games which are newer in the last 10, 20 years, which came out of Germany and are quite popular around the world. And so I was just wondering if that was the style of games we would be talking about.
Yes, it probably would be. Yes, they probably would be. A mixture, old and new.
Got it.
Yeah. We did several homestays, and they all have a huge bookcase full of 50 to 100 board games.
That sounds like my bookcase, so I understand that.
Yes, yeah.
Excellent. If you were standing in the prettiest spot that you saw in Finland, where would you be standing and what would you be looking at?
It would be at the top of the Esker, the gravel glacial, where you can look out over 2 lakes full of rocky islands with pine trees and views of the wooden houses. And if you got the tower across to Tampere with its huge brick chimneys, that would be my favourite.
And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Finland?
Probably the only place that you can get away with having a wife-carrying festival.
Okay. And if you had to summarize Finland in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use? Happy,
light, certainly when we were there, and dark in the winter.
Okay. Excellent. Our guest again has been Jane Deer, and we said Jane is a travel writer, and I think you explained already the tales of an interrailer. Basically, you're talking about traveling Europe by the Interrail pass in this latest book.
Yes, we travelled through France, Switzerland, and then up through Holland and Germany to get to Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland. And the book is a light-hearted account of our travels for 3 months on trains and the people we met along the way and the places that we visited. So I try to give people information about the places that we visited. The whole of what I've talked about today is in the book, but also...
Plus a lot more info.
Plus a lot more, yes.
If we had talked about your entire itinerary, we would have been here all day.
You would have been, because we were in Finland for 2 weeks and travelling for 3 months. So but as I say, if North American listeners can do the Eurail, and many do, so I'm on several Facebook pages and lots of Americans come on and ask questions about doing the Eurail. You can do it either continuous 1 to 3 months or 2 weeks, or you can do 14 days in a month. So you have 14 travel days, and it's good value. And of course, the European train system is extensive to North America. Right. So it's a good way of traveling around Europe. And you can use it in most countries, all the way across to Turkey, Western Europe, the UK, throughout. So I would definitely recommend it.
Well, Jane, thanks so much for coming back on the show, talking about your love for Finland.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
I suspect we will have Jane on again sometime in the future.
Yes, absolutely. I'm a big fan of the podcast. I certainly will be pestering you to come on again at some point and listening to your wonderful podcast along the way. I always take it with me on my travels and always use it to research my destinations. Thank you for all you do for us travellers.
You are most welcome. Special thanks to the patrons of this show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. If you're interested in becoming a patron of the show, you can learn more by going to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. I heard from Dan recently, who responded to the show I did recently on Belize and Guatemala. Chris, I just finished this podcast and laughed out loud when you messed up on your 3 words to describe your trip and you added Mayan. That is not as easy as it seems, is it? I've had some good summer travel as well. Portugal, England, Albania, and Hawaii. Yeah, Dan, I actually left in my mess up there just as a tribute to all of the other guests who have had to put up with me asking them to summarize a whole week-long trip in just 3 words. Lisa responded to the recent episode on Nepal, loved the recent episode on Nepal. There is so much to that country besides an Everest trek, and you guys captured it so well. Thanks so much, Lisa. Glad you liked it. Dave Lee from GoBackpacking.com, a friend and former guest on the show, said, Belize and Guatemala were my second foray into backpacking in Latin America way back in 2006. Amazing how much there is to see and do in the region. I still miss Key Cocker and Belize, such a relaxing little island. I spent a week of my trip there. Thanks so much, Dave. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more